Fascism. There's much talk of fascism these days, but fascism itself is rarely, if ever, discussed. The word fascism is mostly used by leftists as an insult against political opponents. But who are the real fascists? Are there, in fact, fascist philosophers? Well, there is Julius Evola. Julius Evola was an Italian philosopher, painter, esotericist, and baron. And if he wasn't a true fascist, then no one was. Evola lived from 1898 to 1974. He was a popular intellectual in both fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, and he collaborated with both regimes. Mussolini himself admired Evola for a period. In his books, Evola advocates for a strictly hierarchical social order, in which unmitigated authority passes from the upper caste of society down to the lower. In 1934, Evola even dedicated his book Revolt Against the Modern World to Mussolini's militarized police force. As to whether Evola referred to himself as a fascist, in 1951 the Italian government put him on trial for engaging in fascist activities. Evola pleaded innocent on the grounds of his not being a fascist, but rather a super-fascist. Generally, however, Evola referred to himself as a traditionalist, which we will return to later. But why bother with Evola, given that he's a scary-looking Nazi collaborator that most people have never heard of? Well, two reasons. The first is that Evola is more important than you might think. Many of the prominent figures of the alt-right, including Steve Bannon, Richard Spencer, and some more obscure guys on YouTube and elsewhere, cite Evola as a major influence. The second reason to bother with Evola is that even people who oppose his politics nonetheless recognize his work for its erudition and influence, people like Hermann Hesse, Umberto Eco, and Carl Jung. To confront Evola's thought is therefore to confront a steel man rather than a straw man of fascism, and thereby to strengthen our own thinking. So to begin, Evola identifies as a traditionalist, meaning that he believes humanity should return to a traditional way of life, one that embodies the rituals and values of the past. You might think that there's a problem here because different cultures have different traditions, but Evola has an answer to that. Evola isn't concerned with any one tradition, but with a capital T tradition, a collection of ideas and values that he believes is unchanging and that appears in different historical epochs to differing degrees. Evola believes that one can discover what tradition is by looking at various ancient civilizations, like ancient Athens, Egypt, Rome, and India, and finding the commonalities between them. Thus, Evola's texts are extremely dense with references to ancient texts concerning law, ritual, and philosophy. Plato's Republic and the Laws of Manu being two of his privileged sources. Here's a typical passage from Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World. In traditional symbolism, the supernatural principle was conceived as masculine, and the principle of nature and of becoming as feminine. In Hellenic terms, the one, which is in itself complete and self-sufficient, is regarded as masculine. Conversely, the dyad, the principle of differentiation and of the other than self, and thus the principle of desire and movement, is regarded as feminine. In Hindu terms, the impassible spirit, Purusha, is masculine, while Prakriti, the active matrix of every conditioned form, is feminine. The Far Eastern tradition has expressed equivalent concepts through the cosmic duality of yin-yang, and so on. The transcendent tradition that Evola exposits is characterized by a system of strict social hierarchies, the preeminent one being a caste system, with priests at the top and warriors, merchants, and finally slaves below them, and another hierarchy being the domination of women by men. Evola is a thoroughgoing elitist. Above all, he insists that some individuals are metaphysically superior to others, and that society should be organized accordingly. Evola marries his exposition of tradition to a critique of modern nihilism. In Evola's eyes, traditional people were mystics, warriors, and hunters, people who really believed in something, and who lived for something beyond themselves, whereas the people of today are weak, sedentary animals, living for small pleasures and always lost in the superficial phenomena of the material world. Evola believes that our egalitarianism, our feminism, our consumerism, and our naturalism are all symptoms of a species spanning decline. Now we might ask ourselves what is compelling about Evola, or why he is so popular. For one thing, there's his erudition. Evola displays an astounding knowledge of esoteric philosophy through the sheer quantity of quotes and references he puts into his writing. It is no surprise that Jung, who shares this quality with Evola, was impressed by him. What is also compelling about Evola is his critique of modern nihilism. In certain passages of Revolt Against the Modern World, Evola lays out in very beautiful prose an account of the banal meaninglessness of consumer society. But when Evola's critique of modernity is cogent, it is not unique to him. You can find similar, if not superior, critiques in everyone from Pascal to David Foster Wallace. In fact, Evola's critique of modernity is strikingly similar to those of Nietzsche and Marx, who did not share Evola's ethical vision, which suggests that Evola's diagnosis of modernity does not directly imply the cure he proposes. Now we should turn to the question of what is wrong or insufficient in Evola. For most people, the answer to this question is quite simple: his fascism. Those who simply assume that fascism is wrong are hard to fault, especially from a historical perspective. But when we turn from the practical to the theoretical, it is clear that there are larger gains in finding shortcomings and inconsistencies in the internal structure of Evola's argument. Evola's theory of tradition is unfalsifiable. Evola supports his notion of what tradition means by citing textual sources from across many ancient civilizations. He claims to have identified one shared transcendent tradition in these civilizations by extracting their commonalities. Clearly, however, the tradition of each of these civilizations is different, and what is common to Egypt and Rome may not be common to Rome and India. Evola deals with this by arguing that each great civilization realizes a particular set of aspects of tradition, and each fails to realize another particular set of aspects. As he says in Revolt Against the Modern World, the dimension of that which is universal may appear in different aspects and different degrees in various civilizations and traditional organizations. The formative process always encounters resistance from matter, which in its determinations caused by time and space acts in a differentiating and particularistic sense in relation to the effective historical applications of the one principle that in itself is superior and antecedent to these manifestations. This allows Evola to produce his notion of tradition by picking and choosing isolated elements from among these ancient civilizations. But it is unclear why one should prefer one assortment of these elements to another. For example, if we wanted to counter Evola's view that patriarchal domination is part of tradition by citing the facts that Plato argues for the equality of the sexes in the Republic, that in the Indian epic the Mahabharata the heroes all end up in a polyandric marriage with one woman, and that the Greeks and Romans represented wisdom with a female deity, then Evola could respond that these are all just examples of the resistance of matter, interfering with the manifestation of tradition. But why not hold the opposite to be true? Why not hold that patriarchal domination comes from the resistance of matter? All Evola can do here is pile on more examples, which probably explains why he does precisely that throughout his writings. He makes another argument, that the truths of tradition are discovered in mystical experience through ascetic practice, but this is an appeal to inspiration, which is an argument of last resort, and one usually deployed by people who believe something only because they want to believe it. Ultimately, it's clear that Evola decided what he wanted tradition to be in advance, and selectively picked his examples from history in order to give his worldview a false appearance of credibility. Okay, Evola's theory actually is falsifiable, and in fact false. Let's assume for a moment that Evola is right, that all these ancient civilizations really do share in some essential features, and that we moderns have strayed far from their way of life. That's fine, but there's no reason to call what Evola discusses tradition, or to think that it's especially transcendent or important, because it represents a way of life that existed from ancient Mesopotamia at the earliest, to the end of the Ghibelline Holy Roman Empire, which Evola regarded as the last manifestation of tradition in political society. That means that tradition reigned on Earth from roughly 3000 BCE to 1200 CE, so that it lasted for about 4,200 years, which is about 2% of humanity's 200,000-year history, and even then only in select regions. In most regions across human history, humans lived in small, nomadic, and virtually egalitarian communities, which in no way reflect Evola's notion of tradition. Evola wants to bolster his worldview by making it seem primordial and universal, when it is in fact anything but. So does Evola anticipate this criticism? In fact, he does. In Revolt Against the Modern World, Evola argues that the earliest humans lived in pure traditional societies, in his sense, with the rest of human history being characterized by decline, and he responds to the counter-evidence from empirical history by denouncing it, saying, "To uphold with tradition that in the beginning there were no animal-like cavemen, but rather more than human beings, and that in ancient prehistory there was no civilization, but an era of gods, this to many people, who in one way or another believe in the gospel of Darwinism, amounts to pure and simple mythology. Today, the aristocratic idea that mankind has higher origins, namely a past of light and of spirit, has been replaced by the democratic idea of evolutionism, which derives the higher from the lower, man from animal, civilization from barbarism. This is not so much the objective result of a free, conscious scientific inquiry, but rather one of the many reflections that the advent of the modern world, characterized by inferior social and spiritual strata and by man without tradition, has necessarily produced." Evola's argument is blatantly circular. He denounces what he calls evolutionism for opposing tradition, when the value of his notion of tradition is precisely what is at stake here. Evola also makes further appeals to inspiration in his response to evolutionism, saying that those who are spiritually advanced will be able to see that he is right. In either case, Evola is being inconsistent. He relies on empirical historical methods to tell him that the Republic was written by Plato, that the Indo-Aryans migrated eastward from the Central Asian steppe, and so on, but he abandons these empirical methods as soon as they contradict his theory. We can see again that Evola has his beliefs decided in advance, and that he only selects the sources that he can use to promote his beliefs. Ultimately, Evola is not very impressive as a philosopher. He appears to not be a very deep thinker, but rather a skilled rhetorician who knows how to give his ideas a semblance of intellectualism through complex prose and aggressive bibliographizing. In more ways than one, Evola prefigures the ideologues of the alt-right, who have also been learning to cloak their worldview in pseudo-intellectualism. In March 2016, Alam Bokhari and Milo Yiannopoulos co-penned an article for Breitbart titled "An Establishment Conservative's Guide to the Alt-Right." In it they said, "There are many things that separate the alternative right from old-school racist skinheads, to whom they are often idiotically compared. But one thing stands out above all else: intelligence. They're dangerously bright." In the next paragraph, Bokhari and Yiannopoulos identify Evola as one of the intellectual forefathers of the alt-right. All I can say is, if Evola is the best they've got, then they have a lot of homework to do.